So good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Charleston Literary Festival. My name is Deborah Kennedy Kennard. I'm a member of the Charleston Literary Festival Board of Directors, and it's a great pleasure to have you join us for day 6 of the festival. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please silence your mobile devices. Okay. Thank you. Now, I have the privilege and honor of introducing two people whom I greatly admire and respect. Historian, scholar, and distinguished university professor, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. As well as civil rights attorney and my friend, Armand Derfner. They'll be discussing Dr. Glaude's book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. Dr. Glaude is a distinguished professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. He was born in Moss Point, Mississippi. Since I'd never heard of Moss Point, I looked it up. So at the 2010 census, the city had a population of roughly 13,700. That was a 22% decline from the population in 2000, the last time the census was taken. In the most recent 2020 census, the population dropped again by 11% to just over 12,000 people, of which 71% were Black, 21% white, and 3.7% were Hispanic Latino. Apparently, the city is known for its majestic Spanish moss that hangs from historic oak trees. So that's how the city got its name of Moss Point, I guess. But Dr. Glaude left Mississippi, and at age 16, he was enrolled at Morehouse College, graduating in 1989, and while he was there, becoming student government president. He holds a master's degree in African American Studies from Temple University and 2 degrees from Princeton, a master's and a PhD in religion. He's a respected scholar and highly accomplished author who writes about complexities of race and the American experience. I found this description of him to be very insightful, and I quote, "Combining a scholar's knowledge of history, a political commentator's take on the latest events, and an activist's passion for social justice, Glaude challenges all of us to examine our collective American conscience, not to posit the greatness of America, but to establish the ground upon which to imagine the country anew." Dr. Glaude is a columnist for Time Magazine and MSNBC contributor. I understand he was on Morning Joe this morning, so I'm glad his flight got here in time for this session. And he regularly appears on Meet the Press, although he's also appeared on CNN, Fox News, and C-SPAN. He will be in conversation with my good friend, Armand Derfner. Armand has been a civil rights lawyer for over 50 years. He helped desegregate university systems and other institutions throughout the South. And through his advocacy and arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court, he shaped the Critical Voting Rights Act, He's been involved in numerous other significant civil rights and public interest cases, and I had the honor of interviewing him in January at the Charleston Literary Society when we discussed his most recent book, Justice Deferred. This is going to be a great conversation. There'll be 15 minutes for questions from the audience at the end. Please give a warm welcome to Eddie Glaude and Armand Derfner.
Thank you, Sister Deborah, for that gracious introduction. I am a little country boy from a small town on the coast of Mississippi. It is gorgeous. It's also called the River City, so it has all of these beautiful bayous with moss dangling from magnolia trees. My mother and father are still there. My mother cleaned toilets for a living at Ingalls Shipyard. And my daddy delivered mail in Mississippi summer heat to make us possible. So just give a shout out to my parents and the family who made it possible for me to be here. It's also good to be back in Charleston. It's been a while. Last time I was here, I think I spoke at Circular Church. We had a wonderful time. Brother Jeremy is so beautiful. The congregation is so wonderful. Charleston is so beautiful. And, of course, the food's good. So it's a delight to be in conversation with Armand and to be here with the festival against the backdrop of a moment, of a time of intense crisis, a moment where it feels as if the country stands on the edge of an abyss, as if the foundations of American democracy are eroding right in front of our very eyes. I set out to write Begin Again because I was trying to make sense of something. I had witnessed all of these young people in the context of Black Lives Matter. One of the activists I met in Circular Church, who's no longer with us, right here in Charleston. And I was trying to wrap my mind around their sacrifice, their willingness to put their bodies on the line as they were grappling with the horrors of the death of Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and Ayanna Mathis and Sandra Bland and all of these folk. And they had us in some significant way grappling with the central contradiction that rests at the heart of this extraordinary republic. That we've imagined ourselves as a democracy that affirms the capacities of everyday ordinary people, and yet we're committed to the idea that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. And that commitment shadows and colors everything that we do. Shadows our sense of ourselves, right? And so these young people were battling the latest battle in some ways, fighting the latest fight that stems from this contradiction. And then the country responded by vomiting up Donald Trump. I chose the verb on purpose. And I wanted to figure out what can I say to them? What can I say to me? Because I was in some ways struggling with a sense of madness. What does it mean to continue to fight for this place? To continue to believe that democracy is worth sacrificing? And these people keep doing this over and over again. My daddy had to deal with it. His daddy had to deal with it. I had to deal with it. And now my child will have to deal with it. I wanted to figure out how to find resources to hope in the midst of the latest betrayal by the country. The latest instance in which people would say, we've gone too far, we need to double down on this idea that some people should be valued more than others. And so I knew that there was someone who had experienced this too, that I wasn't alone. that my desire to scream out loud on national television, every time Nicole Wallace, whom I love, turns to me and said, "Eddie, help me understand," I wanted to just drop an F-bomb. Every time Joe, whom I love, says something that pushes the boundaries of reason, I wanted to scream. I literally worked hard to hold myself together. The moment that we were in, as I was writing the book, I felt like the ghost in Toni Morrison's Beloved, where the pieces were trying to come apart, a tooth would come out, the head could barely stay. I was losing myself in the midst of it. So I had to find resources to write myself through the abyss. And I knew Jimmy was waiting for me. I had been afraid much of my life to read him. Why? Because Baldwin demands as a condition to say anything about the world that first you must deal with you. I remember, and I'm not going to talk too long because we have to have a conversation. I want to hear from you too. But I remember when I was writing the book, I had signed this contract, got my contract. I'm an academic. I write academic books. This was just my second trade book. And my mother would say, have you started that book? And I hadn't. And when I tried to write, the sentences were not dancing. And I remember literally, I have a saint's candle that's right next to my study, my computer. And it was sent to me by Reverend Bishop Barber. Because he said, you're writing something, you're working on something that's really important. And it's a saint's candle of Jimmy. By the way, I grew up on the coast, so I grew up Catholic, in the Josephite tradition. So I had my saint's candle, and I was lighting it. And I remember Jimmy said, well, old boy, I could hear him clearly. Well, old boy, if we're going to do this together, you're going to have to deal with you. You're going to have to deal with that old man that you look just like. So I had to grapple with the wound that's at the heart of me and confront the fact that I am and I remain this frightened little boy with daddy issues. And then suddenly, the sentences started dancing. Why? Because Baldwin believes that the messiness of our world is actually a reflection of the messiness of our interior lives. That if we just look what's happening under the cover of night in the South, we would see how deeply complex we actually are. So what does it mean to confront the ugliness of who we are as a precondition to confront the ugliness of the nation? And so it's in that moment, along with too much Jameson, that I embarked on writing Begin Again. And there I found in Baldwin's words resources to respond to the young people who had risked so much to change the nation and now faced a nation that was experiencing what Abraham Lincoln would describe as the spike of the fever dream again. And what I decided to do really quickly, and then I'll come to you, Armand, is that I decided to focus on, you said 10 minutes, I'm trying to take 10 minutes. I decided to focus on the late Baldwin, the Baldwin that most folk don't read. Typically when we turn to Jimmy, we turn to the early Baldwin. We turn to Go Tell It on the Mountain. We turn to Notes of a Native Son. We turn to The Fire Next Time. And there Baldwin is in, his power is clearly evident. He is faithful, hopeful about the possibility of the American dream. Love, we have to tell, he tells his young nephew, the trouble, old boy, is that you have to love them. You have to love them. But the late Baldwin scares the hell out of people. He's angry. Many people feel that he lost, a touch. He lost a step in his craft. He succumbed to the propaganda of black power. Folk don't want to read Baldwin in this moment. By the time Jimmy dies in 1987, many black folk are more interested in which sweater Bill Cosby's wearing and instead of what Baldwin is saying. And so I put at the center of the book, No Name in the Street. Not The Fire Next Time, but No Name in the Street, a book written in 1972. And he called it, excuse my language, even though there are young folk here, I'm going to say it. I'm not going to say it. I can't say it. The young folk here. My mother's just popped me in the back of the head. Don't you say that. Right? He's called the book this mighty MF. Why? Because he was trying to tell the story of how the Black freedom movement collapsed. What happened in the moment after Dr. King was murdered? What did it say about the country that they would kill an apostle of love? What would it mean that all of these young people who risked their lives in the bowels of the South, right, would now be shouting Black power, that these were America's children? Baldwin was trying to grapple with a sense of betrayal, that the country had turned its back on. And No Name in the Street is this book centered around the death of Medgar Evers, centered around the murder of Malcolm X and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, he tries to figure out how might we come through this. And he spies Reagan on the horizon. And then, of course, the book's title, and I'll shut up. The book's title comes from his last novel, Just Above My Head. And it's a reflection on what happened after the collapse of the movement. He said, some people left the country. Some people were dead. Some people committed suicide. Some people had lost their minds. And then he says, but responsibility is not lost. It's abdicated. And if one refuses abdication, then one begins again. And there I found my hope. We must begin again. Thanks.
Wow. Well, Professor Glaude, I'll call you Professor if you don't mind. Takes me back to my old student days.
It's Princeton connection here.
Yes. Yours is an incredibly textured book.
Thank you.
And it builds on the more than texture of James Baldwin, one of the most wonderful authors. I have to tell you, my wife told me, be real careful because she's been reading James Baldwin since she was a young high school girl.
That's wonderful.
And so she wants to learn more. Putting those together, and the wonderful talk you gave just now, gives us a chance to look a little bit more, because there's so much more I want to learn. Before I started your book, I had all kinds of questions. Now I feel like when I've finished the book, I've answered so many of those questions and got more. So let's try a few now.
Sure.
One of the first things you talk about in the book is what you call, or what you say, that was a lie.
Yeah.
You talk, I think it's right in your chapter 1 probably, and you go through a number of things that we have gone through here in this country. And you say, it's almost like a church refrain, that was a lie. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of a phrase that makes me cringe every time I hear it, because it usually comes when there's a shooting, when there's a disgraceful incident or whatever, and it's, that's not who we are.
Yeah, yeah.
And every time I hear it, what's true is that is who we are. Mm-hmm. But when we say that's not who we are, that's what resonated with me when you said that's a lie, because that's not who we are is an attempt to say we didn't do that. We're not responsible for it. We are at arm's length. So where does that was a lie, how does that fit in your system here?
Well, I mean, there's a piece that Baldwin wrote in 1960, I think, entitled The White Problem. And he says the people who left Europe, right, and decided, I'm paraphrasing, and took themselves to be founding a democratic republic, right? Had to reconcile that with the fact that they held chattel. And so they told themselves this story that these people were not, in fact, human beings. Because if they weren't human beings, and this is the line, he says, then no crime would have been committed. And then he says, that lie is the basis of our current trouble. Right? And so there's this sense in which Baldwin is grappling, and he's not alone here. You can see it in Du Bois's 1903 text, The Souls of Black Folk. You can see it in Martin Luther King's speech around the centennial birthday of W.B. Du Bois. There's always this notion that America has to tell itself a particular kind of story in order to absolve itself of its deeds. But if you read your Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson for the students in the back, right? If you read your Emerson, Emerson's perfectionism presupposes that you leave a self behind in order to reach for a higher self, right? This is what his perfectionism is all about. The irony, of course, is life ain't been no crystal stair for black folk, to echo Langston Hughes. But if, in order to leave a self behind, you have to what? Confront that self. So part of the problem with the country is that because it refuses, this is Baldwin's point, to look itself squarely in the face, it can never leave it behind. It's always haunted. It's permanently docked in the station. Because we tell ourselves these lies, this broad architecture, right, of why the world looks the way it looks, that absolves us of our sins, when in fact, right, we're stuck precisely because we refuse to acknowledge and admit who we are.
So then you come, and at the other end, near the end,
right,
you talk about an edition of the Montgomery Advertiser. Montgomery, Alabama was the first capital of the Confederacy, and you talk about what they did on the day that the great museum, Bryan Stevenson's museum in Montgomery, opened. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I mean, it was a kind of an admission of the role of the newspaper in several lynchings, a kind of acknowledgement of the paper's complicity in the horrors of this uniquely American ritual. If you get a chance to go to the Montgomery Museum or the lynching memorial, please do. It's extraordinary. And so it was a kind of acknowledgement of one's complicity. And in some ways, that acknowledgement sets the stage for what Bryan Stevenson is trying to do. Remember, he says, he has this wonderful line. He says, truth and reconciliation is sequential. First, you have to tell the truth in order for there to be reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And then I would add, you have to tell the truth in order for there to be reconciliation, which then sets the stage for repair. And so the Montgomery Advertiser saying, acknowledging that in that moment was really, really, really important.
So are there other instances of that? I mean, is that something that has spread? Is it an isolated situation? Do you have a sense that more people are looking our past in the face?
Yeah, I mean, we tried. And then we had the debate around CRT.
That was my next question. I had it all written down. Critical race theory.
Right, because you think about the moment in Black Lives Matter, right? You had it here in Charleston. We saw it across the country, right? There was this, suddenly in the midst of this groundswell around police violence, we were talking about Civil War monuments. You remember, just how did this happen? Some people were asking the question. And so part of that moment involved or entailed, right, an attempt to kind of confront the stories that we've told ourselves. Right? What does it mean for me as a young child growing up in Mississippi, right, to think, and I'll admit this, to actually have as one of his heroes, because I loved reading about the Civil War, Stonewall Jackson. what the hell? What does that, I mean, what has happened in terms of the way in which we tell that story, right? Not only what was going on, because my parents were working, I was going to school. Why? How could it possibly be the case that Stonewall Jackson, if it wasn't for him being killed, they would, what? Right? And so you had this moment of confrontation around the stories we tell. And you immediately saw a resistance. And really quickly, you can see this in the context of radical reconstruction and redemption. Right? So as Reconstruction happens, and I'm from the South, we're all sons and daughters of the South, the challenge that immediately happens, it happens with the Dunning School in Columbia University, the history department, that begins to write the first histories of Reconstruction. And so what you get is a particular story, that the problem, it wasn't the South. The problem were these northern carpetbaggers. The problem were forcing these black folk into responsibilities of governance that they didn't have the capacity to do, right? So we begin to tell this story. The Civil War monuments actually emerge at a moment when there's an attempt to consolidate a certain vision of the South itself over and against what happened in the context of Reconstruction. So you deny us, so in other words, you tell a lie about who you are. And so here we are in that moment, trying to grapple with, trying to have this reckoning. We tell a different story, and people worry we're going too far.
That lie was so effective. I remember teaching a class back in the 1960s, class of black school children. I think it was junior high. And at some point, I said, well, tell me about Reconstruction. And they said, oh, what happened to Reconstruction? Well, one student after another said the same thing. Reconstruction was a period where we had a chance, but we lost because we weren't ready.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, so critical race theory, CRT. Is that something to be discouraged about? Is it a sign that maybe more people are catching on, and that's why there has to be a backlash, an organized backlash? Right. What does it mean?
First of all, in the book, I reject the language of backlash.
Okay.
It has a particular kind of history.
The lash.
Yeah, and it's also a way of, it's a very genteel way of saying that white people are being racist again. You see how quiet it got in the room? Right, and that the reason they're being racist again is because of us. We're asking too much.
Some of these words really get out of, for example, the word redemption for what happened to Reconstruction. My friend Vernon Burton, who's my co-author, gets really offended. He's a good Christian. He says, they have stolen the word redemption.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, so the first thing, this is a footnote. I use the word betrayal as opposed to backlash.
Okay.
Because it carries a different kind of moral resonance.
But
I think also, I think CRT, we have to understand it for what it is, right? So I had a debate with, I forget Chris's last name, but the guy who actually was behind pushing CRT as an issue. And he said, he actually tweeted, our objective is to put everything we don't like about the current moment under this category. So critical race theory is everything that they don't like about kind of the effort to build a multiracial democracy, right? So whatever you teach, so the 1619 Project, critical race theory, books read during Black History Month, critical race theory, right? And so you find yourself, at least I found myself on television, trying to argue with folk who really weren't interested in whether or not they actually had the phrase, that they were using the phrase correctly. It didn't really matter whether or not they understood, whether or not they actually had, whether or not they were correct in their usage of critical race theory. What they were trying to do was use a shorthand to talk about all of this stuff around racial reckoning. And it was really a way of mobilizing fear and grievance. So the argument I kept making is that it's not about trying to get them to understand what critical race theory is, a legal philosophy that's basically taught in law schools, not in kindergarten, in the first and second grade, right? That's a red herring, because whether they have it right or wrong is not the issue. The issue is how they're using critical race theory to mobilize grievance and fear. So the idea is they're teaching your children to hate themselves. They're teaching your children to feel guilty about who they are. They're teaching your children all of these things that will upend the social order, right? And using critical race theory as the shorthand. So to me, I see it as part and parcel of this ongoing betrayal that we're experiencing. It's just the latest
version.
Well, it's the latest battlefield. So to my mind, there is issue around immigration, issue around voting rights, the attack on the Capitol, CRT. There's a through line to all of that. But, that's my politics, and you guys know that. So.
Well, let me bring it back to James Baldwin.
Yeah.
Okay? Because he, in fact, brings something else that they hate, sex.
Oh, of course.
So what would James Baldwin died in the middle of the Reagan administration. Since that time, gay people live in a different world than they used to. Mm-hmm. President Obama was elected and got tens of millions of votes twice. Mm-hmm. At the same time, Donald Trump got 74 million votes after people knew who he was. Mm-hmm. We have CRT. Mm-hmm. We have January 6th. What would James Baldwin think about the world we have now and where it's going?
I'm always hesitant to try to anticipate what Jimmy might think about the current moment. There's over 6,000, he's written so much you can glean from it what you might. I know what I've learned from him is that, there's a kind of madness at the heart of the American project. Dr. King put it this way in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? There's a kind of national schizophrenia in the country when it comes to matters of race. On the one hand, we are adamant about democracy, but on the other hand, when race matters, come to the fore, we're willing to throw democracy into the trash bin over and over again. And so I think as a close reader of Baldwin, we're in this moment precisely because we refuse to grow the hell up. That there's an immaturity, there's an adolescence at the heart of the American project, and that adolescence is rooted in this ongoing desire to believe that we're innocent, Armand.
But we refuse to grow up, you're saying, but you refuse to give up.
Yeah, that's why I drink a lot of Jameson. Irish whiskey.
That's in the book, too.
Yeah, yeah.
So, why? Is it your religion? I mean, we have people who call themselves evangelical Christians, tens of millions of them.
Voting for
They're our
Herschel
problem,
Walker.
right?
I'm just saying, no matter where you are on the ideological spectrum, huh? I mean, we can have disagreements, but huh? But anyway, no, yeah.
So
from whence? Yeah. From whence the hope, right?
What keeps you going?
There's nothing about the condition of the slave that would lead her to believe that she could be anything but a slave. Just nothing about the material condition of the people out of which I come, which would lead them to believe that their lives could be anything but that of a slave. But you could look in the eyes of a man right in front of you and see the glint of love. Even though that person could be snatched from you at any moment, but you see love. You could hear, if just for a moment, the sound of innocence outside of your shack. Children playing. Children who will see unimaginable cruelty. So much so that Thomas Jefferson would write about it in the notes on the state of Virginia. But those children, you see, just for a moment, you could hear innocence. You could see love. in the midst of barbarity. And those fleeting moments, Armand, give you the elbow room to imagine an otherwise, to see yourself beyond the opacity of your condition, as Charles Long would say. So if I'm in this moment that's dark, that seems as if there's no possibility of a tomorrow, that these folk, once again, as my daddy would say, have lost their damn minds. How then do I find resources to imagine an otherwise, to fight for a world that my son can live in, to fight for a world that, right? So it's in that moment that the imagination has to kick in, right? That this world doesn't, the world as it is, doesn't have the last word. And to do so in light of a blues sensibility. Remember B.B. King, nobody loves me but my mother. And she could be jiving too.
This is, what an enormous faith. Now let's bring it back to Jimmy.
Sure.
Where does he come in the formation of that faith for you?
Oh my God, there's this moment. Remember, I'm dealing with the late Jimmy in the book.
Right.
And
The
by the
more
way-
discouraged, the more depressed, etc.
Yeah. What's the name of the bookstore? This bookstore? Buxton Bookstore. I'm going to buy a copy of Begin Again for every high school student that's back there. All right? So you all get it, okay? Baldwin, after King is assassinated, he collapses. There's another failed love affair. He never believed that he could be loved because his daddy told him that he was ugly. Can you imagine that kind of wound at that early age? So another love affair, it's collapsed, and they've killed this apostle of love. He makes his way to Istanbul, this place that stands, this kind of vestibule, vestibule between the East and the West and the East. And he's working on No Name in the Street. He's being interviewed 1970 by a reporter from Ebony magazine. And Jimmy's holding forth, he liked Johnny Walker Black. And, he drank a lot of it. And so he's holding forth at a party. And then so the reporter says, but what about hope? And I remember when I came across this in the archive. And Baldwin stops, smiles that big tooth grin, that big tooth smile. And he says, hope is invented every day. And when I read it, I go, oh, damn, hope is invented every day. Hope is invented every day. If hope is invented every day, that means you have to beat back despair every day. You see the
He
move?
had a lot of experience at that.
No. So if you have to invent hope every day, that means every day you got to figure out how to get up out the bed and put your feet on the ground and get up. And so that formulation for me, right, captures brilliantly and profoundly, the work that has to be done to face the world as it is. W.E.B. Du Bois put it this way: after he's buried his son, who died of scarlet fever because the hospital wouldn't treat him, and he writes this elegy in the Souls of Black Folk, Armand, called this Of the Passing of the Firstborn. And it's an elegy, but it's a parody of an elegy because he can't find comfort. It's almost like Emerson, dig him up again, get him out the grave, as Emerson is grappling with the death of his son. But Du Bois says, it's a hope, not hopeful, right? It's a hope, unhopeful, but not hopeless. You see? A hope, not unhopeful, but you get the point.
Yeah.
A hope
Well,
that isn't a hope that is not hopeful, but not hopeless.
And so what you're telling us, and what James Baldwin is telling us, is that it's the people who have had to struggle just to survive, who have the notion of what it is to keep on struggling when you know it's hopeless.
Yeah, he calls those
And
people.
that's what the future is.
He calls those people the improbable aristocrats in The Fire Next Time, you know. And you know, the thing is that what does it mean for all of us? You know, when I read Irish literature, I don't just like Irish liquor. But when I read Keats, when I read Yeats, when I read Joyce, right, there's something about, you know, the human endeavor, trying to deal with the ugliness of life, to forge a sense of what it means to be profoundly human in the face of the darkness of what human beings are capable of. When I read the Russians, right, can you imagine, you know, reading Turgenev and trying to figure out, you encounter Bazarov and Fathers and Sons, you know, this modern figure, and you see that, you know, he's this modern character, he's boastful, you know, science. Love put that big dude on his ass. He didn't know what to do when that love hit it. How deeply human we all are, grappling with the reality of loss, of death, of mourning, right? We all have the capacity. It's not just those of us who've gone through the cauldron. We all have the capacity to imagine the world otherwise if we attune ourselves to the complexity of what it means to be a human being making his or her way from womb to tomb. Because we all are doing it. We all go, as Cornel West used to tell me, we all gonna end up, Brother Eddie, the culinary delights of terrestrial worms.
Thurgood Marshall used to say, I get awful tired saving the souls of white men. And I think that's what you're really doing here. That's what you're really doing here. And James Baldwin may not have thought he was doing it and may not have wanted to do it, but that's what you brought him home for.
You know, there's Baldwin's we changes after King's assassination. You know, in some ways, in the early part of his career, he understands that if we're ever going to get beyond this, we have to, in some ways, help white America see itself beyond whiteness. That how can I put it? You're more than being white. Right? That to lose white identity is not to lose who you are. Right? But the emphasis shifts this we. He's like, they're going to have to figure that out. In the meantime, we got to raise our babies in the midst of it. Right? I got to make sure that my son, I'll tell this story really quickly because we got to get to some questions. But, you know, my son went to Brown. He didn't want to go to Morehouse. He actually said he might go to Howard. I was like, you're really trying to get kicked out of my house. But he's now at Berkeley Law. He wants to be a public defender. And
for the money, no doubt.
I got to keep working for a long time. But I remember he came home one summer and he was working for this nonprofit around death penalty. And he was so excited because they were going to lobby the State House in New Jersey. And he had one of those tight H&M suits on. You know, those, I don't know how they walk around with them things. You know, he had this H&M suit and he was gonna get in his Honda Civic and he was all happy and so he drove. Now he walks into the house and I immediately see something's wrong. My son is about 6'2". And I immediately see something's wrong. I said, what happened? He said, Dad, I drive into the thing, I try to park, and this cop stops me, and he just starts screaming on me. I was like, what? Yeah, he just starts screaming on me. He said, are you just going to drive by me? Well, park over there. So I pull out, I go to park where he tells me to park. I get stopped again, Dad. And the cop starts screaming on me. And as he's telling me this, he's clenching the back of his teeth. And I see what is about to happen because I've raised him. And he's about to start crying. And Dad, he just starts yelling at me. So he tells me to go park over here. And so I go to park over there, Dad. And then the tears start coming down his eyes. This man stops me, Dad. This cop stops me again. The third cop is a different cop, Dad. And he asks me, who's my PO, Dad? Who's my parole officer, Dad? And as he says it, the tears start rolling down his eyes. So I'm trying to figure out, how do I keep this from taking root in this boy?
Yeah.
So I go get the 25 McCallum. Those of you who don't know what 25 McCallum is, it's Scotch whiskey. And I said, come on, let's, because I'm trying to figure out how to keep the rage from taking root in him.
And turning into, yeah.
And it turning on him. So Baldwin is just saying, in this moment where people are doing, the betrayal is happening, we got to raise our babies. We got to raise our babies in the midst of these folks screaming hate. We got to raise our babies in the midst of all of these videos showing folk getting killed. We got to raise our babies to believe that they can imagine themselves in the most expansive of terms. I keep walking around, traveling the country saying, look, the world conspires to make you small. The question you got to ask yourself is, will you be complicit? If not, then take giant step, John's Coltrane style. In the midst of all of the chaos, while people are trying to figure out whether or not they're going to be decent human beings, we got to raise our babies. You see? Baldwin is right there in that pocket, to use an old drummer's metaphor. He's in that pocket, right? But at the same time, we're still committed to the New Jerusalem. We still got to love our way into a different way of being together, because salvation is not found in our silos. To use Baldwin's language, salvation is found in the going towards.
And you never, never give up.
Can't, my God. If we give up, it's over. I know we got to go to questions.
I'm a PK. That means a preacher's kid. We just went to church this afternoon. That was fantastic. We went to church. So I know y'all have some questions. So we're going to turn to let the audience ask some questions. And just when you have a question, just stand up. I think there's one.
You can ask me anything. That doesn't mean I'm going to answer.
You can stand up.
Just getting
if
warmed
you ask
up.
Your question. That'd be great.
Armand said something a minute ago at the beginning about sex, and you just talked about the New Jerusalem, and you said I could ask anything. So today, it seems to me that sex between white and black people is well accepted. Is that a step in the direction of the New Jerusalem?
Well, what's fascinating, sex has always been accepted.
As
I get your question, but you see, because I can show you my hair and my eyes. There are two Glaudes in Pascagoula. So the interesting thing is that when we think about interracial marriage, it's still the case that when we think about folks marrying across, that those numbers of black and white are still relatively low compared to other interracial couples. So we still have barriers, because there's some interesting ways in which even love finds itself running up against a certain kind of wall. I think Baldwin, Armand's question around sex is so important because, the intimacy requires a kind of vulnerability. People always talk, Deborah, about that last line in The Fire Next Time, when Baldwin says that we, the relatively few conscious whites and blacks who, like lovers, will work hard to achieve our country. People run past the little phrase, like lovers, and they just get to achieve our country. And what Baldwin means by like lovers is that moment in which we're vulnerable. When you stand before your lover with no clothes on, she can see all, or he can see all of your your faults, all your blemishes. Oh, you got a bird chest, and nothing there, right? So, no muscles at all, right? So you are vulnerable in that moment, and so there's a sense in which, Baldwin's critique of how loveless America is, right? How it might have some Puritan dimensions. So, but I see your question to be, what happens when we allow love to flourish across the railroad tracks, across the color lines? Might that be a pathway? Perhaps, but of course, in order for that to happen, some other things must happen too.
Okay. There's a question here.
You got one over here and one over.
One student.
No, Deborah's doing it. I'm not taking it.
Okay.
You just answer them.
Here and then there. Okay.
Thank you for being here, Professor. Comment first before my question.
Sure.
I watch you on MSNBC religiously, and I wish you'd put more of your religious verve into, instead of being so professorial. I love seeing this side of you. And my question, in your book, you speak of the after times, how we've squandered them, and not because we weren't ready, but we squandered Reconstruction, we squandered the Civil Rights Movement, and we're getting ready to do it again. And I know you have hope, and if I didn't have hope, I'd be living in Canada right now. I have it too. So I want to hear what you think we can do, concrete steps, so we don't squander it again.
Thank you so much.
Before you answer that, I have
Sure.
to tell you that I am the person who left the voicemail in your office voicemail. After I finished your book, I was so enchanted by your book, it just didn't dance. It just tangoed. It was wonderful.
You got me up here blushing. How do we know? That's funny. The loud racists are easy. People running around shouting the N-word, wearing hoods. Every moment you just described where we've turned our backs on the possibility of being otherwise wasn't because of the loud racists. It's because of those who think themselves decent, who were worried that we were going too far. In our current moment right now, you have some very loud conservative Christians. There should be an argument had within Christianity about whether or not their version is right. There's a very loud argument. There's some loud people, 74 million of them. The 200 and plus million in the country, right? Might be more than that, 300.
350.
350 million in the country. Where are our voices? We become complicit in our silence. The most dangerous combination we face in this country is the combination of the loud racist, the greed and selfishness of those who believe in money, and the white liberal who's too afraid that we might be going too far. That's like Robitussin. That's bitter,
Yeah.
but we have to face that truth.
Yeah.
I think that's where it gets arrested. So the question becomes, when are we going to be bold enough together to step into the kind of place we can actually be? I can imagine that America. I see it. Yeah.
I think we have
Maybe-
time for, sorry, Armand.
I was just going to say, maybe when the threat is greatest, the incentive is greatest.
Man, it's just so, but in the interim, we have to put too many people in the ground because of it. Yeah.
So, I think we have time maybe for one more question.
This
down here.
is high church.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I talk too much. I run my
So-
mouth.
No. We're
We
here to
have-
hear you.
All right, two questions. All right, we have one
We got
back
to
in the back.
transition the room. Yes.
I'm really looking forward to reading your book, but I wanted to know what you wanted young readers to take away from this book.
Oh my goodness, yes. I'm buying a copy for you. I hear it. Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize lecture. She has this wonderful story where she talks about the bird in the hands of the young man. What I want you to take away from it is that it's in your hands. Something happened the other night that the pollsters could not figure out. They have no idea the demographics of the country. They have no idea what the American electorate looks like. 18 to 29-year-olds shocked the country. They saved the country. Those of us who are J.R. Tolkien fans, you know, that moment when he said, the time of the elves are over, we're going on to, right? The time of the baby boomers is a new moment happening, you know? So what I want you to do, take from the book are resources that may inspire your imagination to think of this place differently, to build the country that you want to live in. Yeah. So I know we have some more, two more or one more?
One more. All right, down here, we got to sell some books, so. Right here in the front.
Ooh, you got the microphone in the middle of the crowd. Yeah, just-
So there is a favorite saying that I have of Dr. Martin Luther King's, and it is, while we may all have come over on different ships, we're all in the same boat now. So what really resonated for me today was when, Armand, you said, you know, we white people have got to grow up, and you, Dr. Glaude, said, we need to not give up. And I think we need to grow up and we need to not give up. And so, Dr. Glaude, this is for you. I, as someone who is trying to work in the African-American community to grow up and to encourage others to grow up, I am finding more of my colleagues that are saying, that are African-American, saying they think they're exhausted from educating white people, that maybe they are giving up. So I would like advice for all of us here who are white. What can we do to support our African-American colleagues and friends so that they don't give up?
Yeah, you know, the world is exhausting. You know, Joe get to run and get to talking about crime. I'm just like, oh, God. Like, come on, Joe. Come on, man. Get clear on your idea of justice. Get clear on what you mean by justice. If you believe that everyone should be treated equally under the law, believe it. If you believe if you work 40 hours a week, you should be able to put a roof over your head and put food on the table, believe it. If you believe that everyone should have access to health care so they can take care of their mamas when the mamas get older, right? Or when they get sick, they shouldn't go broke. If you believe that everyone should have a roof over their head, should have a living wage. But see, the problem is we have ideas of justice with exceptions. Justice for me, for ours, for mine. Get clear on your idea of justice and live it. It ain't physics. You see what I mean? So part of what it means, if what you believe is just for you and yours is applicable for all of us, then fight for that world. Fight for that world. And that's not rocket science. Just justice without exception. Whew. I'm sorry. Yeah. Did that make sense?
You won.
Thank you.